The Lords of Superstition. Written by Anthony M. Mace. Read by Michael Hagiantonis. A Poker Face Media audiobook and Hadithi Comics production. Phase 1. There weren't always dragons in the valley. They didn't much for places like this, quiet little towns on the outskirts of nowhere. Places like this never held much interest to them. The dragons, or for that matter, any of the covenants, preferred much bigger game. So they normally kept to the more robust providence, where there were more people, merchants and noblemen. In other words, a lot more action. Because, when it came down to it, more action meant more and bigger guaranteed profits. Still, here they were, in quiet little Essowood. The infamous Dragon Covenant hunkered down here, in this quaint little town just east of nowhere. Now, just what exactly brings the dragons to Essowood is anyone's guess. This town was all but unknown, and really, there isn't much here but good, honest, hard-working folk. Still, the dragons were here, and sadly, there are few living in quaint little Essowood that are brave or foolish enough to ask why. The dragons, the most recognizable, the most powerful, and for good reason the most feared covenant in all the 7 realms of Irminsul, are here. And so, the good, simple folk of Essowood, it seems, for the moment, are just going to have to live with it. The only thing they can do is wait. Wait out the dragons. Pray they grow very bored with the town of Essowood. Just pack up and leave this quiet little town and its good, hard-working folk just east of nowhere for good. And hopefully in the same way they found it. Well, that's what Tellen was hoping. But as he watches the Dragon Covenant hoodlums stroll casually down the main street of Essowood, he isn't too sure that's how it'll be. "Will you please stop staring at them?" Though Rowena spoke her words low in Tellen's ear, he jumped all the same. He turned and found himself nose to nose with the overbearing, level-headed brunette beauty that is his big sister, whose scolding gaze was not at all as soft as her whispered words were. I'm sorry," he stammered. I just... "You what?" Rowena replied in that quiet yell that was so much like their mother's. "You just what, Plumhead?" Yes, Rowena's whispered words were just like their mother's, quiet as a brook, but firm as a storm. "You what, want to piss them off, maybe?" Tellen perked up and quickly shot back. "Absolutely not." He paused to fish his mind for a proper excuse. He could not find one, so he continued with the truth. "I was just wondering." Tellen lowered his voice a little more. "Why, of all the places in the 7 realms to be, the dragons chose to come here?" As Rowena stood to her full height, she slowly rubbed the bridge of her nose between her fingers and let out a sigh. Tellen. It is not for you to wonder, speculate, or ponder." Tellen replied in the same boyish voice he used many a time, with much success, when he was being chastised by his big sister after she discovered him being mischievous when they were younger. "I know, Ro-Ro." He quickly discovered those times were gone, for Rowena wasn't having none of it. "Do you think you'll be denied sweets after dinner for snooping in Dragon Covenant business?" She mumbled roughly, then leaned in a tad closer. "Or do you think, I don't know, that you're more likely to get your plum head on a stake?" Tellen looked past his sister at the other patrons at the Boar's Crest Inn, only to see them all preoccupied with their own matters. He knew that there was no one coming to his aid, so he had no choice but to look his sister in the eyes and answer her softly through barely parted lips. "On a stake." "Exactly," she answered in triumph. Rowena took a minute and stared at her brother's boyishly sad face. Tellen was by far the smartest person she knows, and not just because he was her little brother. He was thoughtful, caring, and completely socially clumsy. Just like their father. But it was that smile. He had their mother's stunning full-moon smile that got her every time, and that was one of the reasons she found it so hard to stay angry with him. She huffed and handed him the glass of mead she was carrying on the tray. "Here, drink and mind your business. The others will be here shortly." Tellen smiled as he took the glass of mead from his sister. "Thanks, Roro." Rowena hummed and gave him a "You're welcome, Plumhead" wave as she turned to get back to her duties as the Boar's Crest's barmaid, leaving her little brother alone once again with his thoughts. He took a good swig of the mead and set it on the table. He again looked out over the main street of Esserwood, not to gawk and ponder the dealings of Dragon Covenant hooligans, no. They were long gone. No, he was keeping an eye out for the others. And so, with the Boar's Crest patron's ramblings as his backdrop, Tellen sat somewhat patiently for his friends. The gentle flicking of his glass caused small ripples to travel on the surface of the mead. This continued until he caught a glimpse of the two approaching women, both whom he cared for as much as his own sister. There was the insanely gorgeous, always fashionable Eowyn Alexander. But when you're the only child of the most prominent and wealthy family in all the valley, wearing and looking the very best is all but expected. She was arm in arm with the fair-skin, blonde-hair beauty, Darrell Galen, covered as always in the muted grey hooded cloak worn by a mage of those stewards of the mystical, the Cunning Sisters. And though they were still a good distance from the Boar's Crest, Tellen could tell that Eowyn was trying her best to comfort Darrell. Now, he didn't know what could have possibly upset his sweet, free-spirited friend, but he would place a saint's wager that the Dragon Covenant had something to do with it. The worry in Tellen grew as the two women drew nearer. Eowyn spotted him as he waved them over, and she gently steered Darrell towards him and the waiting seats at the end of the open deck area of the Boar's Crest. Tellen stood to greet them and to pull out a chair for Darrell to take. His eyes darted between the two women, almost unsure who he should address his burning question. He settled on addressing them both. "What? What's going on?" Eowyn slowly shook her head as she lowered herself into a vacant seat. Darrell's bowed head was hidden completely by the hood of her cloak. She sat quietly fingering her string of meditation beads. And one thing Tellen was all too familiar with was, if Darrell had her meditation beads out, she was at a most stressful point. At that very moment, Rowena looked out over the bar and saw that two of her dear friends had finally arrived and joined her brother. But, as she approached the table, the look on Eowyn and Tellen's face quickly broke her smile. When she saw the meditation beads in Darrell's hands, she knew something was terribly wrong. Rowena dropped to Darrell's side, throwing back the hood of her cloak. She spoke in a calming, mothering voice. "Honey, what's the matter?" Darrell raised her head, and though she was far from tears, the worry on her face was a clear sign. Whatever she was about to say wasn't good. "It's the chatelaine, Avery." Her voice cracked, far from the bubbly manner her friends are accustomed to. "Those foul Dragon Covenant hoodlums came and carried her off." Rowena's hand clasped her open mouth. Tellen, just as shocked as Rowena, plopped back in his seat like a stone. "Why in the 7 realms would they do that?" Tellen mumbled. "It makes no sense." "You bet your beautiful smile it doesn't make sense," Darrell replied in a hushed voice, which unintentionally caused Tellen to blush slightly. Darrell continued. "If someone was sick or injured, they could have taken any of the senior sisters." She pointed a condemning finger at no one in particular, and concluded, "Why would they kidnap the chatelaine?" At that, Eowyn, hand raised hesitantly, interjected. "Well, was it really a kidnapping?" Eowyn gave Tellen and Rowena's surprised look a quick shoulder shrug.
She said herself they didn't force the chatelaine Avery to go. They asked, she went.
Durrell was a little hurt that her account of the whole situation was rebuffed, gave a soft, muffled reply. Well, and returned a shoulder shrug of her own. The moment of silence was again broken when Éowyn chimed in brightly.
Oh, I know what would help, Rowena. Do you have any more of that wine imported in from North Merrow Farms?
Rowena stood, hand on hip, and fixed Éowyn with a disappointed glare.
You believe a strong, robust wine is what's needed, huh?
And before Éowyn could utter a word, Durrell, sounding like her perky self again, answered,
Oh yes, that would definitely help.
Rowena's shoulders dropped in delighted disgust, harumphed, and walked off to retrieve the wine. Her mission was halted when a familiar voice shouted out behind her. Hey, hold on a minute there, madam. You didn't take our order. Rowena spun back around to see that Aldhelm was approaching. He was accompanied, as always, by his twin brother, Kenhelm. When it came to the Canterbury twins, their faces, coal-black hair and height, were undeniably identical. But Kenhelm's body frame was much more defined, firm and muscular. Due to the fact that he, of the two brothers, was the one who did the heavy lifting, welding and swinging of the blacksmith's hammer at their father's shop, Aldhelm preferred the gadgets and building. He was the tinkerer, and how he loved the mechanics of the steam engines that needed repair and calibration, almost as much as his drink. We'll have, Aldhelm began, only to be briskly cut short by Rowena's boisterous laugh. Really, Aldhelm, like I didn't know what the two of you want to drink. Aldhelm smiled and threw his hands up in surrender, leaving Rowena to turn and get back to her task of retrieving drinks for her friends. The brothers grabbed chairs from an adjoining table and squeezed in alongside the others. In the middle of slapping Tellen on the back with greeting, Kenhelm caught sight of Durrell's troubled face, as did his twin brother, Aldhelm. What's wrong, Durrell? They asked in unison. Durrell lifted her chin high and took in a cleansing breath, and told the upsetting events once again. She finished her recount just in time for Rowena's much-desired return with their drinks. Durrell eagerly reached for a glass of the Merrow wine, rushed it to her lips, and took it down in one long swig. Slow down, Durrell, Tellen said, as he softly patted the air. But his words of concern were quickly overridden by Kenhelm's barking voice. Let her be, teacher. She's clearly had a rough day. Kenhelm spilled mead from his glass as he was shaking it at Tellen scoldingly. Okay, Tellen shit back with a sarcastic whine. I just don't think Durrell getting goofy with drink will help matters much. Éowyn spoke up, having just taken a long sip of wine herself. I beg to differ. She took another sip of wine and proclaimed, It's definitely helping. She sat back in her chair and tilted her glass at the men. You three should have some. I promise you'll never drink mead again. Kenhelm, Aldhelm, and Tellen huffed at that and replied together like a well-practiced choir, That'll be the day. Aldhelm leaned in close, and the others followed. He spoke in a whisper that only they would hear. You know, after hearing Durrell's story, what happened earlier at the shop doesn't seem as odd to me now. Rowena grabbed a chair and joined in with a growing look of intrigue on her face. Well, she grunted, are you going to tell us? Aldhelm, with a finger raised to pause the moment, took another swig of his beloved mead. When he was done, he licked his lips, took a quick glance around for wondering ears, and then continued. Well, Winchester came. Who's Winchester? Interrupted Rowena, drawing looks of awe from the others. Who's Winchester? Aldhelm chirped, with a raised brow. Only the son of Edbert the Flame, head of the Dragon Covenant. Aldhelm scoffed, and took another sip of his mead. Oh, that Winchester. I'm sorry. An embarrassed Rowena answered. Aldhelm, with the roll of his eyes, went on. As I was saying, Winchester came into the shop today with several of his bunch, and presented these blueprints for a device of some sort he wished to be crafted.
Aldhelm's eyes lit up with excitement. It was unlike anything I've ever seen. Rowena's face went from intrigue to mild confusion. What does the commissioning of some gizmo thingy have to do with the dragons taking the chatelaine away? Aldhelm looked her square in the eyes, his smile wide and his answer ready. On the surface of this gizmo thingy were a grouping of oddly placed runes. Durrell, along with Aldhelm, had a look of blissful understanding on their faces. The others, however, glanced at one another in hopes that at least one of them knew what in the 7 kingdoms Aldhelm was talking about. Aldhelm now, with a look of total disbelief on his face, gawted at his friends in bewilderment. Really? Runes? Seeing that they were lost, he gave them the answer they sought. Runes, ancient mystical ones, just like those in the books Durrell is studying to become a cunning sister. Full understanding splashed on their faces like cold water. Now it was clear. It was also clear to Aldhelm and a slighted Durrell. Her words were a mixture of hurt and disappointment, all mashed together. So, no one but Aldhelm takes an interest in what I want to do with my life. She quickly scanned the shameful faces around the table, but when she got to Tellen, she froze. Not even you, Tellen? Isn't learning and understanding things what teachers do? Tellen looked down into his glass of mead and said nothing. Durrell sat up, with her arms tightly folded in indignation, and mumbled her disdain. Well, so much for the goals of higher education. Rowena slapped her brother on the back of the head and asked the one question that overshadowed all questions. Just what the hell are the dragons doing in Esserwood?